So let me welcome you all. Thank you for bearing with us. I'm Bruce Jentleson, professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy and the Political Science Department, and a faculty member of the AGS program. And I want to welcome you all to this event and hope that all of you are, my mantra for these times is that you're healthy, you're safe, and you're adapting, and that you stay that way. And I particularly want to thank, before introducing our esteemed guest, David Schanzer, who's currently the director of AGS, and our fabulous staff, Melanie Benson and Beth O'Brien, for working all this out. And anybody that's been with AGS knows that they do a great job with everything. And it's been no different with the age of COVID and Zoom. So let me, first, before I introduce Ambassador Zoellick in a bit more detail, I do want to make some announcements about upcoming AGS events, which you can always get on their website. But while we have your attention, this Thursday at noon, as part of the AGS Focus on Israel series, there's a conversation with former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren. You do have to register for that, and space is limited, so be sure to go ahead and do that. And then a week from Wednesday, October 7th at 5:30, my colleague, Professor Simon Miles, will be hosting a talk on German reunification 30 years later with Professor Mary Surratt. Clearly has written some of the most insightful books on this period that Ambassador Zoellick knows very well. And there'll be others. The AGS crisis simulation is taking place the weekend of October 8th, 9th, and 10th. Students will be assigned to teams ranging from the intelligence community to foreign governments to take on challenges surrounding the pandemic. There'll be more information in the chat as we go along, and also on the AGS website. If you have any other questions, be in touch with Melanie Benson or Beth O'Brien for more detail. So it's really my great privilege to welcome Ambassador Robert Zoellick as our guest today. He has had a really extraordinary, distinguished career in public service and in the private sector as well. But he served in some positions in the Reagan administration, then in the George H.W. Bush administration, was the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. Under Secretary of State James Baker, also served as counselor to the Secretary. And then the latter part of the administration was Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House. He re-entered government service under President George W. Bush. And was the U.S. ambassador, the U.S. trade representative, which carries ambassadorial status, and also became president of the World Bank, I think 2005, 2006, I don't have the dates mistaken. He's currently senior fellow at the Belfer Center, International Affairs, at the Kennedy School of Government, which is part of the Duke of the North, as we like to call it, also known as Harvard. So Bob, it's great to have you with us. We're really pleased you could join us, and we would have loved to have you on campus and engage with you over drinks and dinner and small groups, but thank you very much for being with us tonight.
I'm pleased to be with you. And as I hear about your crisis simulation, I can think of a few that are out there for you to simulate, but
yeah.
You may not even need simulations.
Yeah, boy, isn't that true? Hopefully our law school would be working on some as well. Let me just say a word about how we're going to proceed tonight. We will do a conversation between me and Ambassador Zoellick to kind of get us started. Our focus is his recent book, America and the World, and I'll say more about that in a second. And then we'll leave ample time for questions and discussion. And between Melanie and I, we'll do our best. Use the raise hand function on chat. And that will be the best way to kind of get your questions in. And we will end promptly by 7 o'clock. Because I know everybody wants to get ready for the Yankees-Indians playoff game. I mean, get ready for the presidential debate, but some of us ex-New Yorkers do need to pay attention to something in between. So anyway, thanks again. So Bob, I really have to tell you, I've read a lot of books that try to place American foreign policy both today and historically, and give us a historical sense of where we came from. As well as draw out those lessons for today. But I really greatly enjoyed your book. I think its focus on history and leaders is really important. There's also a lot of books out there right now. It's the season, as we know. There are many study commissions, which is always true in an election year. So Could you talk a little bit about your book and maybe talk particularly about what you see as its comparative advantage for what students and others can get from your book in this fairly crowded, book market these days?
So again, thank you very much for having me, and it's a particular pleasure to be with the Duke University community, because what really drove me to write this book was to try to help relate the study of history to thinking about policy. Frankly, in all my jobs in government, I often tried to think about how history could help me analyze problems. And at least from what I've learned from some of my younger colleagues over the years, a number of foreign policy courses nowadays are taught using international relations theories. And that's fine and well enough. Those frameworks are nice to debate. But as I try to think about issues that I worked on, whether they be German unification, as you mentioned, or global climate change frameworks, or trade agreements, or Darfur, frankly, then I don't give you a heck of a lot of guidance about what you should really do in the course of a problem. And so I recalled over 20 years ago reading Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, where he used history to talk about foreign policy. But at the time, I had a sense that it was very much written from a European perspective. So for a number of years, I've been thinking, how might I try to do this in a way that would bring back some of the American experience and ideas? So the approach I took, as you mentioned, was to focus on stories, and particularly to highlight people and episodes. I partly wanted to pitch for people that are interested in biographies or multiple biographies, but with the real notion of trying to encourage people to think about these as practical problem-solving ventures. And in a way, again, as you would know, Bruce, the field of diplomatic history has faded somewhat over the years for understandable reasons. People have wanted to bring in, scholars have wanted to bring in different actors and underappreciated perspectives. But I think we've lost something. As I did this book, one of my colleagues in a seminar was Fred Logoval, and Fred wrote an interesting piece that sort of asked, why have we stopped teaching political history? And in a way, this was a modest effort to try to nudge back that would be satisfactory to scholars, but also for students and a broader audience. So in a way, you can think of each chapter as kind of a case study, and you'd ask sort of, what would you do in these circumstances? And I hope, in addition to general readers interested in history and biography, it will be of use to students. I've been struck that both a former Canadian diplomat and a current Australian diplomat are now going to use the book as part of their professional training programs. So that's encouraging. And maybe I can do the same for the Foreign Service Institute here.
Well, that's great. I think, anybody that you go to the National Archives, and carved on the stone as you enter is what's passed as prologue. And I think, we sometimes really as Americans, we've had a relatively short history, and we may not have as much of a perspective as Europeans or Chinese or Asians. But I think it's so important to see where some of the debates that we've had, go right on through our history, and that mix. And, as a card-carrying political scientist, I share your view, to a great extent of much of the debate is way up at 35,000 feet. I will say that sometimes from my own service, when I've been in the State Department and the Clinton administration and the Obama administration, sometimes things can get a little too ad hoc, each case and each cable. And so the question sometimes is, how do you combine history and a little bit of what Alexander George, who was a great scholar at Stanford, would call middle range theory. And some of that comes to the relationship between history and leaders, and the debate about, does history make leaders or does leaders make history? What's your view? Where do you kind of process that debate?
Well, I clearly come down on the side that I think it was Carlyle, that leaders in history is biography. Obviously, you have to look at the overall context, and individuals alone, cannot determine the course without understanding the larger currents going on. But when I've thought about this question before, I asked myself, well, in 1940, did it matter whether Lord Halifax was prime minister or Churchill? And I think the record is pretty clear what would happen. But you know, it's for people to decide. I mean, we're going to have leaders that have to face these decisions. And I guess one of the things that I noticed, I used to torture some of my younger colleagues at various government posts with history because I enjoyed it and wanted to see how much they knew. And insofar as they learned some history, it tended to go from World War II on. And I think there's a lot of interesting examples from the first 150 years. And I've tried in this book to bring back some of the people like Charles Evans Hughes and Elihu Root and others that people may not, John Hay, may not have known well, but it's quite interesting. And I suppose one other aspect of that is that, you know, I saw recently that former Secretary Mattis was commenting about the challenge of operating in a defense environment where the United States didn't have all domain dominance. Well, in much of our history, we didn't have all domain dominance. So maybe there's something to be learned about some of these experiences. And I think particularly now that we're at a time of flux, you know, I didn't want to write a memoir. I didn't want to just write about the Trump administration, but I'm hoping that people can draw out some of the ideas and perspectives that'll also be useful as we think about where we go.
So let's dive in with that, and we'll bounce around historically, but I thought we'd really start with the part 2 of your book, the chapters on John Hay, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, because that period of the late 19th, early 20th century, it's really where America begins to emerge more actively in our own hemisphere, but, you know, more involved globally, obviously leading up to World War I. And each of them kind of, you know, stress a different theme with them or their roles, but I feel like that period is underappreciated. Most people do start with World War II in 1945. Can you talk a little bit about that period and your views of the influence of those three statesmen during that period?
So one of the ideas that I try to draw out is, you know, most of us have grown up in the era of alliances from 1947 on. But of course, much of international relations for the United States for the first 150 years was how do you engage in the world without alliances? So it's important to understand these people in the context of their times, whether it was an international law issue or a balance of power and mediation or arms control with Charles Evans Hughes. They didn't want to be part of the European alliance system. They didn't want to be part of the European security structure. But they were trying to figure out how they would engage internationally. Trade is another sort of important part of the issue. And, you know, an important dimension of this, of course, in that era and this one, is the American public opinion. So one of the themes that I also draw out is how a successful foreign policy needs to be based on congressional and public support. And so in the case of Teddy Roosevelt, you know, he consciously used the Great White Fleet as a way of demonstrating to the American public its sort of international place. But my chapters about him focus on his mediation in the Russo-Japanese War and in the first Moroccan crisis, which most people probably forget. But frankly, it was one of those incidents on the borderlands of Europe that could have sparked a global war just as it did within a decade in the Balkans. And what's striking about Roosevelt is this is an era where the American diplomatic corps is still pretty rudimentary. But he, in a sense, he uses his own network. He uses his relations with the French and German ambassadors, as well as a groomsman from Britain who was operating in St. Petersburg. And he almost draws them to help him with these mediation challenges. And in some ways, it's a precursor of what happens in the alliance era, where America is most effective when it sort of draws other people to its side. In the case of my chapter on Woodrow Wilson, I focus on the decision to go to war in 1914 and 17. And here, he's having to deal with what he describes as the public's dual wish. They want to be sort of away from the war and the conflict, but they're also struck by the submarine war at sea, which they want to go away. So he takes a concept that really dates back to the Hamiltonian period of neutrality, and he tries to redefine neutrality in a different era, which really sort of leads him to sort of collective security concept. And I think, you know, again, one of the chapters, the people that I have found most interesting is Charles Evans Hughes, because he comes in right after the failure of Wilson, the failure of the Versailles Treaty, as he's being named as Secretary of State, one of the senators of his own party, Boyce Penrose, says it doesn't matter who's Secretary of State. He says, we're going to run everything in the Senate anyway. And so Hughes, who obviously later goes on to be a very effective Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, manages to understand what's happening in terms of disaffection in the public after World War I, movement for naval arms control, budget limits, interest of other countries in East Asian security, and really creates his own momentum for this Washington Naval Conference. And part of the point of this chapter is when I studied the Washington Naval Conference long ago, is partly seen as sort of the limits of arms control. And you can draw that lesson, but it's critical to understand how he was trying to deal with East Asian security at the same time. And from that perspective, there's a lot that one can gain as you think about North Korea or Iran. So I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal earlier this year trying to say, you're never going to deal with North Korea alone as a nuclear issue. You have to deal with it in the cockpit of regional security with Russia and China and Japan and obviously South Korea. So as in general in my stories, I try to get the facts and the colors so it'll be interesting, but I try to add my assessment and maybe add some teasers as to how this may be applied in the future.
Yeah, and in addition to the chronological, you have those 5 themes that cut all the way through, and we're going to talk a bit. Let me bring 2 of them to bear in this period. One was you focus on North America. I actually want to expand that to the hemisphere, and the other is this notion of American exceptionalism. And so thinking about Teddy Roosevelt, and actually Wilson too, and Latin America, where during that period we had quite a few uses of military force, military interventions, whether it was Mexico or Cuba in the Spanish-American War, or a number of other countries. Were we just being sort of a big regional power like everybody else, kind of throwing our weight around? Or how do we see that period? I mean, we would often claim to be supporting democracy, but we clearly had certain economic and other interests at stake, and the people we chose to support weren't necessarily Thomas Jefferson's. How do you analyze those trends when they seem to have some tension between them?
Well, in this case, in the case of the hemisphere, I actually start with Henry Clay in 1825 and 1826. And as you may recall, after the Monroe Doctrine, it gave a sense of kind of what we didn't want others to do in the continent, or to the degree the hemisphere, but it didn't say what we were going to do. And so there's this conference called in Panama, and Henry Clay, who was a very strong supporter of Latin American independence, sort of convinces John Quincy Adams that the United States should take part. And the instructions that he wrote for his delegation, he later considered to be sort of his greatest state paper. And they're kind of interesting about his concept of trying to use trade and, frankly, religious toleration. He kind of had his own view of the benefits of neutrality versus kind of the European system. But he was sort of mapping out what becomes the Western hemispheric idea that has sort of gone up and down over time. Now, the facts of that story are wonderful because, of course, they get caught up in the Jacksonian politics, and they spend a whole full congressional session trying to simply get the money to send a couple of delegates down and to get the delegates sort of confirmed. And one dies along the way and the other arrives too late. So that in a way is kind of a warning about sort of the relationship we want to build with the Western Hemisphere. But then I think after that, it's very much related, even as it would be today, with trade and economics. So James Blaine, as you may know, starts the notion of reciprocity treaties with sort of Latin America, and that kind of moves forward, but then when Congress changes trade policy, that moves to the side. When you ask about the Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt period, I think one has to understand the Caribbean in a different context than the rest of Latin America. This is part of America's security perimeter. And as you know, when Elihu actually is trying to work out the legal arrangement for Cuban independence after the Spanish-American War, he develops the Platt Amendment. And he later, which allows the United States to intervene in exceptional circumstances, so it's defined. And he later in life sort of explains, he said, you can't understand this unless you understand Kaiser Wilhelm. And what he's talking about, and again, people forget this, the German Empire under Wilhelm was out in the Pacific, it was playing in Venezuela, it was engaging in power politics. And this was the era where if countries didn't pay their debts, well, frankly, Europeans would come in and take over the customs offices. But Root was deeply disappointed because Roosevelt used that power, in his view, much too quickly when there was a sort of a breakdown of governance in Cuba. Root was actually on a 6-week trip to Latin America, which was one of the first overseas trips by any American Secretary of State. I think the first was Seward. He traveled by sea in the Caribbean. And he actually shook his arms like this and said, "They've killed my baby, they've killed my baby." Because again, I think, as you know, it's important to put events in the historical perspective. This was certainly a limited grant of independence, but in the world of 1900, Europeans and Japanese were trying to grab colonies as opposed to trying to figure out how to establish them in a different way. And of course, that runs through our history. The Cuban Missile Crisis, sort of the seminal event in terms of nuclear diplomacy, is in the Caribbean. It relates to our later policies in Central America. So it's one of the reasons why I try to focus on North America as a potential continental base, particularly with Mexico and Canada, not only because the issues of immigration and economics and crime and environment are what the American public is interested in today, but because we'll be much stronger if we are able to operate with healthy neighbors. So I found this quote from Ronald Reagan as he's launching his campaign in 1979, where he said, "We'll be better off if Canada and Mexico are stronger, and it's time we stop thinking about our nearest neighbors as foreigners." Well, you certainly won't hear that in the debate tonight. So I think, what as you then point out, in the Cold War, it's a combination of economics and security arrangements. And it's a worry about revolution and its communist influence. You have the Alliance for Progress from Kennedy, which is partly based on modernization theory, which was one of the development theories of the time. Onto sort of Reagan and Bush 41 and Clinton's notion that we can try to create a Summit of the Americas, a free trade agreement of the Americas. I was very active with that because, frankly, I negotiated, not only had done the NAFTA, but did with Central America, Peru, Chile, Colombia, Panama, Dominican Republic. And just to have you a sense of how this relates today, you could imagine that if the United States sort of regains its interest in trade policy, you could interconnect those free trade agreements, just like the Trans-Pacific Partnership was interconnected. And at some point, if Brazil or Argentina wants to make a big move on sort of opening up the economy, you could create a different hemispheric unit. So one of the other ideas, Bruce, is that some of these ideas we've seen in the past, they resurrect. And the question is whether you know what went wrong and what can be done to improve them.
Yeah, I actually think we'll get to this in some ways. This post-Cold War period, in some ways bears closer resemblance to various historical periods than the Cold War may have because of the very unusual circumstances of the Cold War and stuff. But I want to go back for one more thing and then start working our way to the present, which is classic George Washington's farewell address, "Beware entangling alliances." And we hear that invoked a lot today. America First has an element of that, but not just America First and not just Trump's version. We've been hearing that in different versions, in a lot of different ways. How do you interpret in exactly that spirit what Washington meant in his moment, and what parts of what Washington said are wisdom for today and today is different, and how we think about these things should be different?
Well, I think the starting point is Americans have always thought about America first. The question is it America alone? I think that's the fundamental distinguishing part with the current administration. Fundamentally, I see the farewell address as a plea for union. And remember, Hamilton is the principal drafter. He works closely with Washington on this. But they don't want to permit, first off, they don't want to permit the foreign conflicts, remember the French Revolutionary period, from destabilizing American politics, because this was the big breakdown between Jefferson and Hamilton and the relationship with Britain and France, up to this time of 1796. Well, that has a certain resonance today about foreign powers, whether you want to keep foreign powers from interfering in our election process. They were also wanting to avoid Europe's conflicts and hence the caution about no permanent alliances. Jefferson later makes it no entangling alliances. But I think some people mistook that for an isolationism. Hamilton is anything but an isolationist. He understands how America has to fit into the Atlantic world. But this is again where, some practical facts matter. The customs revenues that he created in his financial system are paying about 90 to 95% of America's revenues all the way up to the Civil War. Right. And so he wanted to avoid war with Britain, or frankly, the undeclared war with France in 1798, because he felt that it would tear up the roots of his credit system. If he didn't have revenue, he couldn't pay interest on the debt. And for him, the strategic imperative was credit, which actually he mentions in the farewell address, because it's the ultimate strength for the United States. And he perceives this. It's quite interesting. He perceives this during the Revolutionary War. After he leaves Washington's staff, he goes to his father-in-law's library in 1781. So this is before he goes off to Yorktown in the final campaign. And he's trying to understand the nature of the war. And it's amazing. He understands it's fundamentally a battle of attrition, where economic credit will be vital. And so when he gets his chance, he needs to build the credit system. And of course, in a wonderful sense of irony, when Jefferson gets his golden moment to buy Louisiana in 1803, he wouldn't have been able to do it except for the bonds that Hamilton had been able to establish as standards. And by the way, a more liberal interpretation of constitutional authority, because Jefferson at first said, well, maybe we need a constitutional amendment. So I think the one other piece, which of course in the sort of distant history we forget, is that for Lincoln, or for Washington, for Jefferson, for Hamilton, the Mississippi River Valley was strategically important as well. I mean, we now assume that's the heartland of our country, but for them, it was the second seashore. And so whoever controlled the Mississippi River Valley was going to control the future of the continent.
Yeah, and my father-in-law actually was during World War II was stationed in New Orleans looking for German subs coming up that Mississippi River, for that particular period of time. I want to ask you, I'm going to roll a bunch of things into a question, let you run with it a bit, and then I'm going to go to the audience. I've got more questions to ask, but I want to open it up. I know we start to lose people, after an hour or so, just the natural Zoom effect, no comment on us. So folks, start putting yourself in the chat box with raised hands, and Melanie and I will monitor that, and we'll get to that shortly. So, you've got, and you served in such crucial periods in the, in American foreign policy over the past few decades. You got chapters on Kissinger and Reagan and George H.W. Bush 41, as he often gets called. And I'm thinking about, lessons of that for today. Here we have in my seminar this morning, we were talking about the Kissinger, Zhou Enlai opening and the statesmanship that went into that. So you have Henry Kissinger, in China, and we're, wondering now about the relationship with China 50 years later. We have Ronald Reagan, who was elected to office. My colleague Simon Miles has written a fabulous book about that 80 to 84 period that just came out that's often ignored. But, we knew a lot about the evil empire, and then against the advice of some of his aides, really believed in Gorbachev and moved to, all the things that Reagan and Gorbachev did together towards the end of the Cold War. And then, of course, President George H.W. Bush and the coming down of the Berlin Wall and stuff. Can you just pick on the lessons you would take from some combination of those three for not so much the agenda that, what's right or wrong about Trump foreign policy, but how you think about where America's going and what we should be doing in going ahead, into 2021 and thereafter? So
I think for Nixon and Kissinger, again, one has to recall, as Haldeman mentioned in his diaries, that he said there wasn't a day that went by that Vietnam wasn't in the Oval Office. So this was the trauma of the facing defeat in Vietnam and withdrawal. And so Nixon and Kissinger, and Nixon had, in some ways, I don't think has gotten enough credit of this, in part because Kissinger gets to write a lot of the histories. but Nixon had this notion that great nations that sort of lose their ambition fail to be great. And so he was willing to take bold moves. And also he thought this was the way to engage the American public. But his bold move was basically to try to recognize a multipolarity in the system and sort of use a triangular diplomacy. What I think that Kissinger and Nixon missed was the economic and technological side, which is something I try to draw in the book. In a way, they saw the declinism of the United States. That was one of the themes of that era. And that brings us to Reagan. Reagan took a very fundamentally different view about the United States' capacity and capability. And as you know, I actually have a chapter in this book about a man named Vannevar Bush with science policy, because I wanted to emphasize the importance of science and technology, not only in the Cold War, but frankly, in future relations with China and in issues like dealing with pandemic or climate change. So I think Reagan is still hard for historians to get their hands around. And in part, it's what I use in that chapter is I use the speech that he gave at Westminster, because I think more than any other president, he used speeches as part of sort of an oral negotiation. And importantly, in understanding him, he used his speeches and before that, his radio addresses to shape his own thinking. I mean, one of my friends was actually the staff secretary for Reagan, and he said, people talk about him as the great communicator. He's actually the great editor. And so what people didn't understand is those writings gave him focus and conviction on sort of basic principles. Now, what Schultz added was quite important, was Reagan also saw himself as a negotiator. And you alluded to this. Many of his colleagues sort of didn't want him to negotiate. Schultz brings Reagan into the negotiation with Gorbachev. Reagan's quite a tough negotiator, but at the same time, he understands that he wants to avoid nuclear war. He thinks with a stronger military and a stronger economy, the United States will ultimately prevail and the values of the United States will prevail. But one of the other lessons about Reagan is he's not a detail person. So if he doesn't have a Schultz or a Baker who helped him in the first term on domestic politics and the international economy in the second term, you could get disasters, as we did with sort of Iran-Contra. And then Bush 41 with Baker, it's almost impossible to understand Bush without understanding Baker. And I think historians will focus on this more, in that these two went back a very long way. And at heart, while Bush was a gentleman and frankly prudent, as he said, he was also fiercely competitive. And you can't understand the 1989 time period without understanding that he was competing with Gorbachev. And Baker was the man on point to make these things happen. So I started out with an experience of 1989 and dealing with Germany and the Conventional Forces Agreement, which many historians have overlooked. So what I tried to do with each of these chapters, your question sort of brings us to the fore, is there's not one formula. I mean, there are different times and circumstances, different skills, different ideas. I guess one thing, Bruce, that I hadn't thought of when I started this, but comes out of the work, is the team around a president matters a lot. I mean, no one individual can handle everything. And so in my chapter on LBJ, I look at the decisions late 1964, early 65 to really have the American take over the ground war. You remember, LBJ did not have a chief of staff. And so his NSC advisor is, in my mind, quite an important place, but the nature of the NSC role was not so fully defined at that time. And so I think part of the tragedy of Lyndon Johnson was kind of, he enters this as a political exercise as opposed to understanding some of the both diplomatic and military and security dimensions in the way that he needed to. So, if you apply it going forward, I think it's interesting. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs just released their survey, their annual survey. I don't know if you saw it, but the data is rather striking. I mean, the American public believes the United States should be engaged in the world by like 68 to 30. The support for NATO is 73%. The numbers for trade are quite high. They're 70, 80, so on and so forth. So this is contrary to some of the new doer conventional wisdom. I think that there's the possibility for people to catalyze public support, but it does come down to political leadership. And frankly, Trump is, in a sense, is the antithesis of a lot of what I'm talking about. He's transactional. He doesn't care about alliances. He's a protectionist, and it's linked to his political authenticity as an outlier and a disruptor. So whether it's the wall with Mexico or protectionism, those are ways of communicating with his political base as much as they are foreign policies.
That's great. So it's great that you plugged Chicago Council. I'm actually on the advisory board for those surveys, and we were briefed by that a couple of months ago. And you're right. people, they're not isolationists. The average person gets it, that you can't pull up the drawbridges, whether it's pandemics or terrorism or climate change, whatever. But, the debate is really about exactly what role we should be playing internationally forward. So the good news is, the average person, not just folks on this call, gets that. But there's a lot of debate about where we go from there. And I think there's some good data there, including, by the way, one of the polls that came out in which people were given the choice between dominant leader, shared leader, and no leader. And 68% said shared leader.
Yeah, it's quite striking. And it's consistent too.
Yeah, yeah. All right, let me go. We could talk all night, but I really want to start with the group, and I'm going to come back with a couple of questions. So James Brock, who's one of our PhD students, I think was the first to have a hand up. Go ahead, James. Unmute. Somebody's got to unmute, James.
Okay.
Okay, you're good, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, Ambassador Zoellick, I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. My question is, I wonder in the 21st century, how many of the problems that we'll face will be global problems, say to resolve a tragedy of the commons that no one country can solve themselves. I think of climate change and sea level rise and species extinction as examples. And I'm wondering, what institutions do you think we will need to leverage or create in order to solve them?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ace. So I'm often asked, is globalization going to be reversed? And my answer focuses on globalization as a phenomenon is not going away for the exact reasons you mentioned, whether it be climate or biological security, or whether it be, frankly, terrorism or proliferation. The governance of globalization has been fragmenting and breaking down. And I think that puts us in a much more dangerous sort of period. People debate the strength or weakness of the WHO. Having run one of the multilaterals and having worked with all of them, the real lesson there is these institutions reflect their members. So as you may know, Gro Brundtland was head of the WHO in the early 2000s. She actually tried to strengthen its authority, and of course every country sort of pushed back. So there is a special sort of challenge for leaders of multilateral institutions, kind of how they can maintain support, but sort of push the edge of the agenda. But to bring it back to the US, and this in some ways connects it with the current challenge for, if Biden's elected, on the one hand, he's going to have a huge domestic agenda. He's going to have pandemic and a frayed healthcare system, increase of economic growth, racism, environmental issues, immigration issues. And that's going to preoccupy him. But I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs Online recently where it said that actually could be a useful agenda to leverage internationally. So if you do something in the pandemic at home with vaccines, why not just rejoin the WHO, but take an initiative like Bush 43 did with HIV, AIDS, and malaria and tuberculosis in Africa. That's totally within our capacity to do. On climate change, don't just rejoin the Paris Accord, but try to figure out how you could draw in developing countries with an initiative, for example, such as soil carbon in Africa, which could be very important for African agriculture, but also absorb estimated 13% of the carbon needs. Avoided deforestation, forestation, adaptation strategies. And if you're on immigration, if we do something for dreamers, then get rid of the idea of a wall with Mexico and try to figure out how we're going to build a stronger Mexico and North American relationship. My point is that if you think about that agenda, what we might describe as a new security agenda, that actually would be a good basis for restoring relations with allies. I mean, you of course need to focus on some of the traditional security questions as well, Russia, cybersecurity, proliferation, but actually, if you're making progress on those items, that's a good basis for discussion with your European partners and many of your Asian partners. And then it's a foundation for dealing with the two biggest challenges, the future of free societies and China. So, part of, and boy, Bruce introduced this in a way, what I'm trying to focus on problem solving, because if you don't get results, none of it matters. You have to know how to connect the dots. And part of the dot connection is domestic as well as international policy.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to apologize for people that I don't know. I'm going to do my best on the names I see, but this is Rahul Krishnaswamy. Next question.
Can you hear me?
We can hear
We
you.
can.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you for coming, Ambassador. It's good to see you again. As you said today, looking at the Trump administration so far, we've seen a reversion from traditional GOP policies on free trade, human rights, alliances, especially now with vaccine development and international development with the recent appointment of a political appointee to head the Inter-American Development Bank. And we've seen foreign policy experts and appointees from the Bush 41 and 43 administration come out and endorse Joe Biden this year. Do you think that this strategy could backfire for the Biden campaign, especially since foreign policy is hard to analyze for the average American and is seen as part of the blob that could be utilized as part of the drain the swamp strategy? Or do you think it could be effective in targeting moderate, educated Republican voters who don't like President Trump and could potentially be powerful swing voters? And in a related manner, could you give us any indication how you might be voting in November?
Yeah, well, sure. That's a very interesting question. And no reason you would necessarily know this, but in 2016, I was an early opponent of Trump because I felt not only the differences on policy, but I was concerned about his fundamental character. And I had some worry about what he would do to institutions and the Constitution, which I'm sad to say have come to pass. And then on top of it, we now have basic competence as an issue in the pandemic. But having been, and I've written a lot of pieces on this, having been clear on that, I hadn't taken a step to formally support Biden because I felt they should manage their politics and it's up to them if they want my support. But it just so happened that Susan Rice asked me to sign a letter that just came out in the past week or so, where I joined other national security people saying that I supported Biden. And I only hesitated. When I was asked, I was quite clear about my opposition to Trump. But I only hesitated for the very reason you mentioned, which is I didn't want to get in the way of their politics. But so I guess their judgment was it's okay.
Let me just pick up on that before I go to the next questioner in the domestic politics, which is also one of the themes throughout your book, and express one of my concerns. If you look at the last 20 plus years of American politics, we've seen tremendous instability, right? And if we think of this like we think of monetary currencies, where the longer the fluctuation in exchange rates is within an equilibrium zone, it's considered okay. Now, in the last 20 years, we've had two efforts to impeach presidents, right? Bill Clinton, 98, 99, and Donald Trump. We had the 2000 election, which went to the Supreme Court. We had the war in 2003, which, many in the world opposed. The financial crisis in 2007, 2009, which America was seen less as the engine driving the economy than as one of the sources of its crashing. Then we elect an African-American president, which many in the world liked, but it's a big swing of the pendulum. And then in 2016, we elect someone like Donald Trump. And so I've had this conversation. I was in Australia on a visiting professorship when COVID hit, and they said to me, if your side wins, how do we know you're going to stay within that political equilibrium zone for any longer than your midterms of 2024? I mean, it seems to me that we've got some deeper issues that have been making it difficult to make a degree of stability in domestic politics that you need in foreign policy. What's your sense of that?
A couple of different thoughts. One, the last chapter of my book actually was Bush 41. But the faculty seminar I had at Harvard said you can't stop there. and it's worth explaining. I didn't want to get to the more current presidents because I believe the history is still settling down, and anything that I said that was critical could be done politically, and I didn't want this to be a political book. So my compromise, as you know, was to write an afterword. And my afterword used my 5 traditions to look at Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, and briefly Trump. And what struck me actually was when you step back a little bit from the partisanship, there's actually a lot of continuity from Bush 41 to Clinton to Bush 43. They're different people, they're different policies. And the real irony is, while Bush 41 is often associated with the end of the Cold War and the Gulf War, whether it's the Middle East peace process, whether it's NAFTA, the Uruguay round WTO, APEC, the only climate change treaty that's been passed. There's a lot of the fundamentals for Clinton and Bush 43. I use a little story when I worked with President Obama about how I think the turn started because of the global financial crisis and some of the challenges he faced. And frankly, he had a sort of a diffidence that people read sort of internationally. And then Trump is a sharp reversal. So, this is, as you know, the way history often interprets things, it depends a little bit on sort of the sequence that follows over time. And I think Trump will be certainly seen as a disruptive force. But the second point is, I've been struck that, it's both a challenge and an opportunity for the United States that the world watches what happens here. So the Black Lives Movement, the Me Too movement, all these become resonating in other societies. And as you know, it's one of our challenges because it's an open society. We freely debate this. As you know, there's problems in China too. People just don't debate them, right? And so I think in a way, if you want to take a positive view of this, if we can come to terms with them, if we can continue to make it a more perfect union, the United States can stand well in the world. And then the practical point would be, it's almost like every time I get asked about the dollar as a reserve currency, it's asked, well, what's the alternative going to be? And I think here's where there's a difference on the security and economic side. On the security side, if you think about the European alliance reliability on the NATO alliance, it's still quite heavy because they're, the French and other Europeans in the Sahel are going to need American intelligence and logistics. So with a little bit of sort of mutual respect, you could strengthen those relations, but you have to upgrade them with different challenges. Similarly in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Australia, while they're uncertain about the United States and they have to think about what they're going to do under various circumstances, it's not so easy to develop plan B. The economic area is more of a risk. And here I've been quite worried because I do think that you're seeing a fragmentation and fraying of the economic system, and that will have costs for everybody. That's partly pandemic driven, it's partly protectionism driven. So I don't by any means take it lightly. And I think where in particular your question sort of should lead people to dig deeper is people do come up with plan Bs. And so if the United States, for example, under a second Trump administration walked away with alliances from, particularly in Asia, well, then you better start to ask what your expectations are for nuclear proliferation.
Okay. Francis, and I will butcher the last name, but in case another Francis, Bexidon, please correct me.
Yeah, it's Debexidon.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much for coming today. I really liked what you said about how, for most of its history, the United States hasn't had, complete multi-domain dominance in the military. Now, and I think a lot of people are imagining a future where we won't have that sort of dominance when it comes to the size of our military, the size of our economy, and they just want to retreat from the world. But so I would like to ask you, what tools do you think we should bring back from our history and our, especially our relatively early history when it comes to negotiating and doing diplomacy when we don't have the upper hand in every single domain?
That's a great question. And I'll tell you one that jumps to mind. For those of you that study diplomatic history, you know that John Hay in The Open Door is sort of was one of Kennan's was favorites about saying, well, this was just a statement. We weren't really sort of serious behind it. It was also critiqued by some of the sort of the economic new left historians in the 60s and the 70s. I find the John Hay story, The Open Door, fascinating because what he freely admits is that he has a goal with China, which is to stop it from being broken up like Africa was and to maintain open economic and frankly missionary relations. But he doesn't have a big hand to play. So what he does, the Open Door notes are basically a story of finding the common ground, building on it slightly, and holding it together with the weak gravity of international cooperation. So in fact, some people said, oh, this is a great new innovation in diplomacy. He actually uses the term, he said, that's flappadoodle. He said, that's not real. But the point is, it does become important in then later shaping American attitudes in the 20s and the 30s about China and our sort of role with China. So I've been reading some of John Bolton's book just just to acquaint myself. And John's attitude is you either have total control and people do exactly what you want, or you tell them to go jump. And that's not the way it's going to work most effectively in diplomacy. And so whether it's based on your economic influence, your combination of security alliances, I have a chapter on sort of Bush and Baker as alliance leaders. Remember, in 1989, the prospect of German unification was a very divisive topic, and Britain and France and the Soviet Union were all sort of opposed to it, and the United States sort of had to understand some of the political pressures that Germany was facing. So early in that administration, people forget. You had the INF Treaty, which eliminated all nuclear missiles left in Europe, except the short-range missiles. And NATO was planning to modernize the short-range missiles. But as one of the German officials said, the shorter the missiles, the deader the Germans. And this was a very divisive topic in early '89. And Bush comes up with this conventional force negotiation, which most historians have ignored, which was to drastically lower and equalize forces. And it kind of put the short-range missiles issue sort of behind us. And he actually had a difference with Thatcher on that. Now, that was based on alliance management, about understanding kind of what the German political need was at the same time that you could make an initiative that would help secure leadership in the alliance. I have a chapter on Elihu Root and what I call the vexed but venerable international law tradition. And what I'm trying to do in this chapter is I'm trying to explain to people that sometimes by hard-headed security people, they're sort of dismissive of international law and say, well, that's a utopian wish. And they look at Kellogg Bryant or something like that. Well, in reality, these were not utopian thinkers. These were people who were trying to figure out how to interact with the world without alliances, without a League of Nations, and also trying to avoid isolation. And actually in the 19th century, America was one of the leaders in the arbitration movement. Now, I closed that chapter with a symposium in 2006 from the International Law Society on its centennial. And there's basically three views represented. One was international law regimes can only work among democracies. Number two, international law regimes discipline democracies. And the third was the international law regimes ignored the need for a basic security foundation and its kind of legal realism as opposed to the evolutionary legal system. Now, my point is, we had a question about multilateral institutions. Every time you hear about rule of law system or rules-based order, think about that multilateral legal system. It doesn't have to be a formal world court or formal arbitration system. It's, can we effectively deal with the challenges of globalization, economic, science, without having some shared sense of rules and norms, okay? So Cohen and Nye developed this in regime management and interdependence in the 1970s. Those are still very applicable ideas that you can sort of trace the origins in earlier period. So actually, one reason I like the 19th century period is because the United States is not an all-powerful player, and we have to use our wits.
Yes, those help. Ashton Merck.
Hi. So as a historian, I'm very sympathetic to the goal of applying history to understand contemporary policy challenges. And I want to kind of move us from substance to methodology, so this may feel like a bit of a right or left turn. I was struck by how you sort of frame your opening remarks, often in terms of presidencies, but you try, like you just mentioned with Elihu Root, you tried to bring in these kind of significant bureaucrats or high-level officials. Although for me, it's like, and maybe it's just because I'm too deeply embedded in this literature, but I was kind of like, yeah, of course, everyone knows about Elihu Root, but that's probably not true. But especially as a practitioner yourself, do you see opportunities, like more opportunities for historians to do even more to highlight the role, not just of these kind of higher level, like cabinet secretaries, chiefs of staff, but actually dig deeper and talk more about civil servants and kind of mid-level bureaucrats in shaping policy? And what do you see as the most effective ways for doing that, methodologically, as well as perhaps even narratively? And you can say, I do it in my book and it's fantastic and you should just do my book. And that's a fine, perfectly fine answer.
No, no, where you're driving is a very important point. A friend of mine, Phil Zellico, who's a professor at the University of Virginia, is trying to develop what he calls sort of microhistories. And they're going to some of the actors that you're referring to, which you do have to understand how they're engaging with others to get an appreciation of how decisions were made. He wrote a piece, for example, I think it's in the Texas National Security Review, about what led to McKinley's decision to actually have the United States acquire the Philippines. And so in many history textbooks, this is either treated as simple imperialism, or there's a scene where McKinley drops to his knees and seeks God's guidance and so on and so forth. Well, if you dig into the facts of what happened, you know, it starts with the fact that we defeat the Spanish fleet and sort of what's next. And there's a German fleet and others sort of hovering overside. There's a Filipino leader, Aguinaldo, but he doesn't really have full support all across the Philippines. And so McKinley sends a general, I'm trying to remember the name, but it's his father, grandfather had been in the Civil War. It's actually a famous military family. And he actually does some very interesting research about what's going on in the Philippines and the risks. And they're trying to say, well, should we just take Manila? Should we just take that island? Should we consider other islands? And so what the microhistory tries to teach students, and in a sense, it's what my book's trying to do, is to say, you know, these aren't all predetermined structural decisions, and you have to understand how people interact with them. So I'm very sympathetic to your view. I think as a matter of historical method, though, here's a caution. You have to be very careful in that historians tend to, not surprisingly, have to rely on the written sources and kind of the memos that people write or different documents. And you have to actually understand the decision-making process to know whether those people were really significant or not. So let me give you a current example. I've talked about this with some of my friends like Phil Zellico, who's done some great research on end of Cold War period. The people on the NSC staff had more time, it seems, to write memos. I worked closely with James Baker. I didn't need to write memos with James Baker. I had lunch every day with James Baker, or I just walked, I'd be with him in meetings. And frankly, you know, so to understand what Baker's role, you have to know to look at the talking points. He was a very careful preparer. The talking points that he used in his meetings with either foreign officials or with the president, because if there was something important, I would be preparing those talking points, or Dennis Ross would prepare those talking points. And so there's some methodological aspect that I think is sort of also important to appreciate here. And then the last point I thought you were going to ask, because this is one of my other themes, is that I don't only mean diplomatic history, or the reason I titled the book America and the World is I'm not just suggesting it's only governmental actors. I also appreciate the role of the transnational actors in the process. And indeed, one of the special things about American diplomacy from the start is that we are opening the world for private sector actors, and first through trade. Trade is our first foreign policy. And remember, we're in a world of empires, and we're a world of sort of government state controlled system. We're trying to open it, whether it's for missionaries or engineers or soldiers of fortune. And I think that's relevant today. So if you're going to work on an issue like climate change or biological security and pandemics, you have to know how those networks work with the non-governmental players. So yes, wonderful research opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, it's interesting, Bob, you raised the WHO, and also Gro Brundtland, you know, is one of the more capable executive or, you know, director generals. You know, so you look at global health, the second largest budget in the world is the Gates Foundation, right? Doesn't mean they're doing everything right, but you talk about the range of actors, or you look at human rights, you know, the main information about what was happening with the Rohingya, you know, in Myanmar, Burma, was really coming from groups like Human Rights Watch that now have the satellite capability that we only used to associate with intelligence agencies. So they're not, I think we're both in the school that it's not the end of the nation state. Nation states are still the principal actors, but there's a range of actors out there that are really important as well for their influence.
Well, and also your point, Bruce, when you asked about sort of America's image in the world, I often use the Gates Foundation for the exact example, but I would also say, you know, one of the things to understand the U.S. role in the world is you do need to move beyond the White House and even sometimes beyond the Congress. So look how energy policy has been totally transformed over the past decade by a bunch of guys that had an idea about fracking and had the capital and things to do it. So actually, I think it's one of our strengths as a society. I hope so.
Okay, so we're going to wrap on this last question, which came in as a written question, and I'll communicate to you, Bob. It's from Wei Lang, and it's on picking up a lot of things you've said on China, and it's asking about, to summarize what's happened in China and the U.S. that has driven the shift in U.S. policy for what the questioner calls engagement to containment. And was there a turning point that Washington came to realize that China would possibly become a responsible stakeholder? That's in quotes. Let me just add to that. I feel like there is a China hawk position that's developing in this country on my side of the aisle, Democratic aisle, as well as on the Republican. That concerns me a little bit because I feel like sometimes we've made some of our greatest mistakes by misestimating or overestimating threats. So great opportunity to talk about where you think we are in China and where you think we should go.
Well, the starting point is, if I have to ask fairly whether China or the United States is a responsible stakeholder today, I'm not sure either one rank very, very high. And remember the context, just to make sure one understands the basis of it. When I gave the speech in 2005, we had China in the WTO, we had China in the IMF, it was in the World Bank, it was in the UN Security Council, it's treaties from ozone depletion to whatever. And the challenge was, that I was trying to raise, was the international system had benefited China. Would it assume some of the responsibilities? And frankly, I could never understand some of the criticism because the Chinese figured this out. You know, I'm basically saying, we need you to do more things in our interest and we'll be the judge. But by treating them respectfully, that was okay for them. I think the starting point, and this goes back to your view or your question, Bruce, there's a new conventional wisdom that has crept in, which is that cooperation with China failed. And this is just flat wrong historically. So, I mean, I wrote a piece in the National Interest. It's in March, April of this year, if you want to look at it. But I go from proliferation issues to economic issues to environmental issues. And there's been a tremendous amount accomplished with China. But that doesn't mean it's all good. It means that the work of diplomacy sort of never stops. I do think that there was a shift with Xi Jinping in 2012. I think the story I use to illustrate this is that when he became General Secretary and President, he created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union, and he ordered it to be shown to all party cadres. And if you had such a film shown in Germany, it would show Gorbachev as the hero that helped end the Cold War. Well, the Chinese version's a little different. Gorbachev's the fool that abandoned the Communist Party and ruined his country. And the not so subtle message is it's not going to happen here. And I think what we've seen over the past 8 years is more and more control of the Communist Party and sort of state-owned enterprises. I think that has actually hurt China. I think in diplomacy, I think that you see this bullying behavior that is counterproductive. And I think that's partly because people are trying to respond to looking strong to the leader, and information is not sort of going to the top. And so in a sense, in going back to the theme of my book, the question is, so what results do you want to accomplish? I've just written an op-ed I'm about ready to publish that says, let's go look at what Trump accomplished on trade. And it's nothing. I mean, even on his own terms, the trade deficit has not gotten any better, and globally it's gotten worse. And for lots of other reasons, Moody's Analytics estimate we've lost 300,000 jobs because of it. So in practical terms, we may not like China. The question is, so how are you going to deal with pandemics in the future? How are you going to deal with climate change? How are you going to deal with North Korea and Iran? I frankly think there's an ability to find more common ground. To be most successful over time, we have to start at home. So in a way, the question that Bruce asked about, not only in our science and our technology, but our own symbol as a society. Then you work with allies, and again, sort of model from the book. And then frankly, you can also find forces in China that realize some of these steps are not going to be in their long-term interest. And so even on the question of values, since Bruce had asked about sort of the Reagan example, you see, rather than sanctioning the Hong Kong leaders, I would do what Britain did, which is to say, let's let people from Hong Kong come to the United States. What better way to show the difference between a free and an unfree society? So I think the challenge is actually going to be right now, the relationship is in free fall. We don't know where the bottom is. I think it's quite dangerous, Bruce. And the challenge will be, particularly if Biden wins, whether somebody can develop off-ramps. They're not going to be able to change this immediately. But I've tried to communicate with people in Asia to say, look, if a Biden administration wants to try to do some things in pandemic or biological security or ecological or climate or inclusive economic growth, you could find some, this goes back to the multilateral forum issue. I could use the multilateral forum to sort of neutral ground for people to find cooperative solutions. But, you know, frankly, this is if the world moves towards decoupling, you could see a world historically that looks more like 1900 than 2000. And remember, in 1900, you know, now the powers would be China, the US, Russia for geographic and military reasons, European Union for economic reasons. We'll see about political and security. Japan somewhat caught between the United States and China. That's a much nastier and more uncertain world. So be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, no, I share your view very much. And I actually missed the question, Bob. So, and it's from one of our recent grads, Max Labaton, who made the mistake of doing some work with me, but still managed to learn something while he was at Duke. And he's also a Schwarzman scholar. And at least when we communicate a little bit, he's still on hold here in the United States. So maybe, Max, you can tell us, as you ask the question, what the status is of the Schwarzman program, which is supposed to send students to China to study, I believe, at Tsinghua, where that stands, and then ask your question of Ambassador Zoellick.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Jentleson, and thank you, Ambassador Zoellick, for speaking to us. Yeah, it's like Professor said, it's still on hold. I think we're still waiting for a few months for visas, but we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, it is based at Tsinghua University. And my question was actually, I think it complements the last.
Before you ask the question, do you know the history at Tsinghua University? Do you know how it was founded?
It was founded, I think, what, 1900s or before?
But do you know why it was founded? I won't torture you. This is, I used to do this with my assistants, but so Bruce has obviously been an easier mentor. This is a wonderful story about American history. So after the Boxer Rebellion, all the other countries decided they wanted reparations, and the United States was the most resistant. But in true pragmatic fashion, we said, well, if they take some, we'll take some. So we took the smallest share of reparations. And the Chinese minister of the United States convinced the United States to use this for scholarships for Chinese students and to help found Tsinghua University. So in Tsinghua, they're quite familiar that this comes from the American reparations from the Boxer Rebellion. It's a wonderful story of how America does diplomacy. Sorry.
No, no worries. I learned something new every day. So that's good. Thank you so much for that, Ambassador, and for the talk. My question actually, I think, complements the last one well. It also deals with U.S.-China relations. And you talked about public opinion earlier in your talk, and one of the areas where it's really souring is, it seems like, on China, and that's in some way, I think, bipartisan, and you've seen that accelerated by the pandemic. And so, sort of in light of sort of public opinion, how do you see sort of views on China playing out in the coming years, particularly in a post-Trump world, maybe even a Biden administration? Do you think that some of these like tensions are more short-term and just based on sort of political calculations, or do you see this, the actions that are being taken now as very difficult to undo? And I know you sort of hinted at this in your last response, but sort of what, if any, like off-ramps do you see, as feasible when you think about sort of decreasing these hostilities?
So that's a great question, and it's sort of multifaceted. And first, exactly as you say, the numbers, the hostility and anti-Chinese feeling among the American public has really increased a lot. Now, that also creates some possibility that the nature of our leadership, frankly bipartisan, blaming everything on China, does affect public attitudes. You might be able to change it. But I think it's also based on substance, as I mentioned. So Xi Jinping's policies towards Hong Kong, or human rights issues in Tibet, or Xinjiang, or others, have obviously sort of soured the relationship. Anxiety about sort of rise of Chinese power, a key factor was the business community. The business community, which used to support the relationship with China, turned quite negative, and that was the basis of support. Now they're quite anxious because they're worried that sort of it will go too far. And I think, so to try to deal with that, again, I'll go back to my normal practice, which is that try to get positive things done that you can build on. You know, so could you get some cooperation with China on sort of climate change issues? Take biological security. This is a good example. You know, as I've said to people, look, China doesn't want to have these future viruses break out either. If you indict China and say, you know, we're going to nail you to the wall for doing it, you're not going to get much cooperation from the start. You know, you wouldn't get cooperation in our country either. Could there be a way, however, that kind of use international organizations and say we have to learn, you know, how to prevent these problems in the future, get various prevention, so on and so forth? The answer, of course, would be yes. On the economic area, this is the hard work of economic diplomacy. Take a subject like intellectual property rights. As China has developed more innovation, it has strengthened intellectual property rights as well as enforcement. It's created courts that have started to fine for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time. However, the penalties are too low. So what, as opposed to doing a crummy purchase agreement with managed trade, which is what we did and is only half being fulfilled, I would focus on getting higher penalties. Forced technology transfer is another troublesome area. It's prohibited by their WTO accession, but the challenge was getting evidence from companies because they're afraid they'd get retaliation. A lot of that stems from the joint venture requirements. So I would press China to end a lot of the joint venture requirements. Or take Belt and Road, and this is one I had personal experience with. I was invited because of my work on Chinese development to their 40th anniversary, and I gave a speech of the launching of the reform. And I pointed out with Belt and Road, I said, look, nobody knows what it is. Is it a geopolitical move? Is it a way to use excess capacity? Is it a development plan? I said, it's probably all of the above, okay? I said, but here's the problem. People are fearful of it. And I used the example of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and said, look, you guys took that idea and you used good governance, procurement, you hired a bunch of people from the World Bank to help you sort of get the rules, better environmental standards. Why don't you use the same approach to the Belt and Road? And I know because frankly, the head of the People's Bank of China said, we're sharing your speech with Xi. So the next year at their Belt and Road Forum, Xi basically adopts my principles. Okay, now you can't stop there. What frankly, however, as opposed to saying we don't like it, we're not going to stop it by ourselves, is that why not form a coalition of countries that are interested in trying to hold them to the principles that he stated? And here you could use international institutions. So my model here would be, I still think you can find a lot of common ground. In some areas, you're going to have to manage disputes, and for example, on security areas in South China Sea. In some areas, we've got to modernize our defense capacity because aircraft carriers are going to be vulnerable, and you're probably going to need different undersea vehicle sort of networks, as Chris Brose wrote in his book, The Kill Chain. So it's a multiplicity of actions, but I think ultimately the American people will realize there are common interests here if we create opportunities for them, and if China, if it's smart, responds to them. But there will be, it's not going to be like it was, 10 or 15 years ago. And one last word on this. This is where the history is important. Remember, the first experience of the United States with China was partly based on commerce. The idea that it's going to always be sort of the great Chinese market, the shining star just over the horizon. And frankly, prior to Trump for 15 years, it was the fastest growing export market, but there's always dangers with that one. But the other sort of part of American history with China was the missionary movement. The missionaries are very important in terms of the idea of converting China to Christianity. Their children became the diplomatic corps, Pearl Buck and the novels that she wrote. So frankly, for 150 years, Americans have been trying to convert the Chinese, whether to Christianity, whether to capitalism, whether to small r republicanism. And you can see the pattern. When the Chinese reject it, as they did in the Boxer Rebellion, or in 1947, or 1989, it hits America even harder because we've tried to convert these people and they say no. And so you get a pendulum of relations. So I think that relationship, it's interesting. It's different than the relationship with India and others. And I think it goes back a lot to the missionary tradition. And so my bottom line on this is, I think we can keep prodding China on change, but sometimes we have to accept China for what it is as opposed to what we want it to be.
Well, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank those of you who joined us tonight. I want to especially thank our just crackerjack team, Melody and Beth, for pulling this off, holding it together, everything else. And I particularly want to thank Bob Ambassador Zoellick for really engaging with us in some really interesting ways. I mean, I think the conversation tonight is not just sort of standard stuff you're going to find on cable TV or even necessarily in the op-ed pages. And I think we penetrated down to see the value of history and some really interesting views, both about how history applies to the current agenda and also about the current agenda in and of itself. It's a fabulous book. You've got the link that Melody's put in the chat box. I encourage you to read it and enjoy it. And Bob, I really want to thank you very much for spending the evening with us, and continue to wish everybody stay healthy, stay safe, and keep adapting. And get ready for the rest of the evening, whatever that means to everybody out there. So thanks again, and look forward to actually seeing many of you in person at some point down the road. Thank you.
I look forward to coming down sometime and seeing some of the students again. Thank you, Bruce.
We'll have you. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye now.